What's up, everybody? I consider this to be a knife making channel. The problem with that is, as of recording this video, I have posted 18 videos and not a single one of them has been making a knife from scratch. It's been remodeling, refurbishing, rebuilding, sharpening, and all that. So I'm gonna fix that, and in today's video, I'm gonna give you the basics of how to make a knife. And what do I mean by that? Well, one of the best parts about making knives, or just crafting in general, is the ability to take something and shape it and mold it to however you want it to look. So, I don't necessarily like watching super in-depth detailed tutorials because I want just the basic footnotes to show me where to go and then I'll figure it out from there. And that's what this video is gonna be. So if what you're looking for is just a quick basic tutorial on how to make knives, well, here you go. I'm gonna break it down into 1-minute segments, starting with... You can think of the design process as simply cutting off angles until you get the size and shape you want. So for this knife, we're gonna start by cutting 2 angles to make it pointy so it'll stab into something. Then we'll cut off another angle so that the blade is a little bit more narrow. For the handle, we'll cut off 2 angles back here, cut off some angles to make room for the fingers. And then all we have to do is go back over all those angles and smooth them out a little bit. So to take that basic principle and refine it, here's the type of design I would normally use. As you can see, the hand size dictates how big the handle will be, the blade size is made proportionate to that, and I throw in some flares such as this blood groove on the back and these bolsters over here. Designing a knife might seem intimidating at first, but if you use these simple concepts, it should be pretty easy and you should be able to pick it up pretty fast. If you need a little bit more information of what's necessary in a design, go ahead and look up blade anatomy and you can find out that there's actually a name for just about every part of a knife. But once you have a design, it's time for... Stock removal is exactly what it sounds like. We're taking the piece of metal that we want our knife to be made out of, and we're cutting angles off of it until we're left with just the basic shape of what we want our knife to be. The first step is to transfer our design onto the piece of metal, and that can be done pretty easily by just cutting it out like a template and then spraying over it with some high temperature paint. Now when it comes to actually cutting that blade out, it's a little bit more difficult and there are plenty of different ways to go about it. You could use a circular disc saw like this, or you could use a hand saw like this, or you could just simply wear down a few grinding belts, removing it all with the grinding machine. Regardless of how you go about it, the basic concept still applies, where you cut off the biggest chunks you can at a time and then you go back and refine it with the grinder. Speaking of which, the most important part to refine during this stage is the profile of the blade. The next step is going to be applying the grind to the blade, and if we don't have the profile just right, we're not going to be able to go back and make changes without completely throwing off the grind. Putting the grind on the blade is definitely the most difficult part of this entire knife making process, hands down. Your top priority is to try to keep the edge of the blade as centered as possible by removing exactly the same amount of material from each side. So either mark out or just imagine the center line of the edge and slowly begin removing material, making sure to be as consistent as you possibly can between both sides. Once you have the initial grind started along the edge, you can begin to slowly angle the knife back so that that grind creeps its way further and further up towards the back of the blade until it gets to the point where you want it to be. If you've never attempted to make a knife before, I would heavily suggest starting by using a hand file because you can control this process a lot better. If you accidentally grind away too much material, you can't exactly just put it back. But once you have the grind taken care of... Now heat treating is going to be the hardest one to summarize in only 60 seconds. The first step is normalizing or annealing. You have to heat up the blade until it's non-magnetic and let it air cool at room temperature. Do this 2 or 3 times to make sure the metal is as normalized as possible, and that leads us to step number 2, quenching. With quenching, you want to heat up the blade till it's non-magnetic again, and this time you have to swiftly dunk it into some oil before it has any time to cool. This will make the blade extremely hard, but also extremely brittle. And that leads us to step number 3, tempering. With tempering, you bring the blade up to a specific temperature and let it sit there for a couple of hours, and afterwards you let it cool down as slowly as possible. This will remove the majority of the stressors from the blade without getting rid of the hardness. Heat treating can be a very finicky process because depending on what kind of metal you're working with, it can be a little bit more picky with the specific temperatures and times. So you might want to do a quick little research and it would be an efficient use of your time. But regardless of what kind of metal you're working with, you should be using these same basic steps. So with the heat treating taken care of, it's time to get this blade cleaned up from the rough grinding and the heat treating process. The first priority is just consistency. I use a 120 grit sandpaper to remove any grinding marks or imperfections until all that's left is a rough, consistent 120 grit finish. From there, it's just a matter of slowly smoothing it out, going up the ladder of finer grits until you get the level of shine you want. Getting a good finish on your knife is definitely the most time-consuming process of the entire knife build, but it is also equally important because any little scratch, any little imperfection will show its ugly head later whenever you try to have a nice finished product. So take your time, do it right, be patient, and before you know it, it'll turn out looking just the way you wanted to, all nice, shiny, and clean. In my case, I went from 120 to 320 to 600 and then used a very careful wet sanding method to achieve the satin finish the customer wanted. And with the blade all ready to go, alright, before we do anything with the handle, we gotta protect the blade that we just finished. Just make sure that you use some sort of painter's tape so you don't have to clean off any sticky residue later. Start by drilling the holes first, preferably before hardening the steel, but if you forgot like I did, just make sure to use some oil and a solid carbide bit and you should be able to cut through. If your design has bolsters, now's the time to rough cut them, tack them onto the blade with some super glue so you can drill the holes, and then bolt them together so that you can grind them down together and they'll match perfectly. For the wood part of the handle, it's almost exactly the same, but you don't want to drill the holes until you can fit both pieces up against the bolsters like little puzzle pieces. And when you do drill the holes, make sure that you have a solid piece of wood backing it up so that you don't tear or splinter the handle piece when the drill bit pokes through. Handles don't always have to be this complex, they can be simpler or even more difficult. But for now, with all the pieces ready to go, it's time to move on to... First up, prep the blade and handle pieces by roughing them up so that the glue will hold better. For metal bolsters, I mix up some JB Weld, apply it to the blade and bolsters, and then line everything up with the pins. You need to peen those rivets, so use a ball peen hammer and just slowly tap in a little circle around the top of the rivets, and this will slowly mushroom them out, and that expansion is what will hold the bolsters in place long term. For mild steel bolsters like this, you can see I flatten them entirely for a better hold, but for softer brass or copper, you might not want to risk dinging it up too bad. Once you have the pins peened and everything in place, make sure you wipe away any excess glue around the edges, mix up some regular epoxy, apply it to the blade and the wooden handle pieces, and then pin everything together and peen the rivets off just like before, but be a bit more careful this time so that you don't go overboard and crack the wood or dent it up. I know it doesn't look very glorious right now, but that makes the next step the most fun and rewarding because we start. The first thing you want to do here is remove all the excess from around the edges, making everything flush with the spine of the blade. If you have metal bolsters, make sure you're regularly dipping the knife in water so that you don't risk getting it too hot and ruining the heat treatment. Once you've done the heavy lifting with the grinder, it's time to work this handle down the old-fashioned way using a file to shape the metal bolsters. Once you have them at a comfortable shape, we can start working the handle as a whole, beginning with a rough grit sandpaper and using the shoe shine method to smooth down the edges and bring the handle to the final shape that fits comfortably in the hand. After that, just like the blade before, now it's just a matter of slowly bringing the handle to the level of finish you're looking for by working your way up through various grits of sandpaper. Personally, I find this part of the knife making process to be the most satisfying because you can finally start to see the results of the hard work, but we're not quite done yet. We still have to make sure it's going to work good, so now we have to take care of... At this point, the blade should already have a pretty fine edge from the finishing process. This is a clip from one of my previous sharpening tutorials, and this is a clip from earlier in this video during the finishing process. You can continue that process by putting some super fine sandpaper over some leather and hone the edge down that way. But if you have a buffing wheel, I would suggest going over to it, using some fine buffing compound to hone it down further, and then use some denser sharpening compound and work it back and forth slowly but firmly until the blade is as sharp as you need it to be. Regardless of whatever method you use, the concept remains the same, where you want to find the correct angle where the edge just very lightly touches whatever you're trying to sharpen it against, and slowly but firmly apply pressure and drag the knife forward and back until you have a very, very fine honed edge. And with that taken care of, we're almost finished. We only have one thing left to do.
We're on the home stretch, but don't slack off now. Getting the final polish right on a knife is surprisingly difficult. The goal is to remove any metal dust, buffing compound, and glue residue, all without letting any of it scratch the finish of the knife in the process. A buffing machine makes a world of difference, and specifically using a fresh clean wheel with some scratchless buffing compound to give everything that final polished look, and following that up with a fresh, clean, super soft buffing wheel to remove any compound from all the cracks and crevices. Once you have everything looking the way you want it to, the final step is to season the blade by using a microfiber towel to apply oil to the entire knife. I typically use olive oil, rubbing on a decent coating, and then buffing off any excess. This process might seem a bit extra, but the oil clings to the surfaces and will help prevent corrosion and rust from forming due to humidity and other things like that. So taking care to season the blade is important, and after that's done, well, that's it. We can finally sit back, relax, and look at how awesome our knife turned out.
Alright, so there you have it, a quick 10-minute tutorial on the basics of how to make a knife. Now yes, the knife that I use as an example probably wasn't a beginner knife with the metal bolsters that were curved of all things and all the fancy blood groove and everything else, but as you may have noticed, applying the basic steps of knife making to even a complex design like that, well, that's all it is. You're taking the basics and building off of it. As far as this knife specifically goes, I think it turned out great. I love how the handle work came together all nice and tidy. I love the look of that snake wood. It is just nice. And it's not very often that a customer asks for a satin finish, so whenever I got the opportunity to do one, I hopped on it and I really like how it turned out. It was a lot of work and it's not perfect, but I think it turned out pretty good given that I was working with such a complex design on the blade with the blood groove and the hollow grind and everything else. Satin finishes are typically reserved for big flat ground knives like kitchen knives. But I think that's gonna about do it for this video. Hopefully you were able to pick up a thing or two. If you've never made a knife before, go for it, follow the basic steps, research whatever you wanna research, and have fun with it, man. Making knives is a lot of fun. Just be careful, be safe. It's knives, they can cut you and the machinery is, well, you know all this already. Okay, I'm gonna stop rambling. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you wanna see more, hit the subscribe button. But other than that, just stay happy, healthy, wealthy, and wise, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.